that you've been able to join us today, Al. I really appreciate you joining us and being willing to kind of talk about your experiences in research. And as a former SURP faculty mentor, I think that you'll be able to share some interesting perspectives with our students, having gone through this experience as well. So why don't we go ahead and dive in for time's sake here, since we don't have a whole lot of time. And why don't you start us off with telling us a little bit about yourself? Where are you from, and where did you attend school, and how did you end up as a criminology professor at Western Carolina? That's a lot of questions and a whole lifetime of work that you're going to have to squeeze into a couple minutes.
Yeah, that could be a 30-minute diatribe right there, but I guess I'll do the very quick version of it and start by saying that I'm the most unlikely candidate for A, a researcher, and B, a university professor, if ever there was any kind of definition of one. And that starts with growing up on a farm in New Jersey, and that right there is enough to blow people's minds, because a lot of people think of the mid-Atlantic states and they don't really equate farming life with what's usually seen as a very urban area. And so that's where it all started, I suppose. And I'll just say too that I'll openly admit that I was very uninterested in school, and it was largely out of necessity. It was because as the only male offspring in my family, I was required to be out in the field as much as possible. And so as I get older, I'm approaching 40 now, I realized that that childhood set me up for knowing what hard work is, and having to just persist in your work in order to generate results, because your livelihood depended on it. And so that's carried over and has remained a theme. But at the same time too, it made me realize that hard labor is not fun. And if I can do something easier, especially outside of or away from the heat and the rain and the cold, then I'll happily do that. So there's a lot of kind of pragmatic reasons that I decided to go to school. But yeah, too, I like to share too with students that I was actively avoiding going to college. The military was an option, but when I had actually a quite generous offer to go to one of the military academies presented, the paperwork was actually on the coffee table, and all I had to do was put the pen to the paper to go. And I said, wait a second, if you don't make your bed, you're doing push-ups? Is that you're telling me this? Like, the disciplinary measures were that extreme? I said, that doesn't suit me very well. So I'll take the college option so I can go have a little bit more fun in terms of the experience. So I ended up in a small liberal arts school. Didn't like it very much. And I went to go visit a big school in the northern part of Florida for a weekend, and had a great time, and also learned that they had an excellent criminology program there. And so at the end of that weekend, I actually took a quick pass through the admissions office, grabbed a transfer form. In those days, it was paper. You actually had to fill it out, and promptly had that stamped and in the mail the following week. And the following semester, I was there on campus. And it was at that time that I really got turned on. I took a drugs and society class. And as they say, the rest is history, because I learned that you could study things that are really interesting, fun to learn about, and relevant. So the nature of drug use, especially how we try to control this with the criminal justice system, is something that's constantly fluid. So it's changing all the time, and that's job security in a lot of ways. And we need research on it to understand this. So that experience at Florida State kind of got me hooked, pun intended, I guess. And then I ended up knowing that I wanted to go get a PhD and do research. And that's what took me to the other school out in Arizona. So I often joke too that I went from one party school to the next, because it was at that time that Florida State actually gave up its #1 party school ranking to Arizona State. So while that's not the true nature of the story, I like to joke that that's the reason that I picked them. But and how did I end up at Western was that I was finishing my degree in 2010, which was kind of the, if not the peak, like just after the peak of the recession. And there were literally like half a dozen jobs, and faculty positions at universities are notoriously difficult to obtain anyhow. And on top of that, I really wasn't willing to just move anywhere. I wanted to live somewhere that had access to outdoor activities, because that's just an important part of my lifestyle. So lo and behold, Western had a position, and I was able to meet some of the faculty at an academic conference, and I guess make a lasting first impression, and successfully landed here, and still here 10 years later. So that's the short version.
Yeah, the short version, love it, and I gotta agree with you. That is, one thing that led Andy and myself to Western Carolina, that access to outdoors. And yes, we too came from big schools, University of South Carolina, that party school mentality. But learned a lot of great things, and met a lot of great professors and stuff that led us down the track that we did. But that's awesome. So as I mentioned before, you're a former SURP faculty member. So can you tell us a little bit about how you became involved in SURP when you did it? You did it, what, 3 years ago now?
My sense of time is so warped. I'd have to dig up the actual dates, but that sounds about right. Yeah.
And who did you work with?
So the student's name was Steve Lawson, and he's since gone on to the master's program in public affairs.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And your project with Steve Lawson, if I remember correctly, it also focused on the opioid epidemic, and it was a very personal project for Steve, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so the timeliness of that was just uncanny. And that's exactly right. So what we were looking at was just how the ways in which contact with the criminal justice system impacts recovery from opioid use disorder, right? So we actually had some data from folks that went through formal substance use treatment programs for opioid use disorder, and whether or not they had been arrested afterward. And so we wanted to find out the way, or how that contact with police in the form of arrest influenced their substance use after treatment. And so at the time, we did find some interesting stuff. And essentially what the main result was that if somebody gets arrested, it's likely to negatively impact their recovery. So it can set them in a tailspin back into just active use and dangerous conditions, because overdose rates are very high and this kind of thing. And then just so happens that at the end of that summer, at the end of that SURP period, I got a call, and that was August. So I got a call like midway through that month that a cousin of mine, who was only about 18 months older than I am, and he has twins that are the same age as my older daughter, and he had fatally overdosed on opioids after being released from jail. So yeah, it hit home really hard in a lot of different ways.
Well, and I'm glad that we are getting an opportunity to talk about this and the relevance, because that's what I think I want to get to with you today. And having this kind of conversation where we see the rubber hitting the road with research, and it, just from the background digging that I did with your work, I see that a lot of what you do is where that rubber does meet the road, and your efforts to try and change policies. And so for me, I think that's the living, breathing research enterprise. And that's a very abstract term or faraway term for a lot of our students, because, I guess not just students, but us as well, we get very much focused on our niche, our area of study, our focus, and sometimes we need to take that step outside of ourselves and look at how this research might find its way into society, be utilized by others in industry, in government, in policy making. So I really hope that we can continue this line of questioning today. And before we kind of really delve into the nitty gritty of that, I'd like to take that step back and kind of set the stage a little bit with you. So I want to kind of start with the numbers. And get a sense and share with the students how many research projects you've participated in over the years as a professional. So since you graduated with your PhD.
That's hard to tally. I'm kind of whimsical in a lot of ways. So if something interests me, I'll work on it. And some of it's not really related. I mean, I've looked at everything from, I guess the other thing too I didn't mention about my background is that my dad was a police officer growing up. So he would work midnight shift on the local police department and then work in the field during the day. And so I guess that's what got me connected to criminal justice. And then one of my older sisters, actually, she does information technology, but she was working for a sheriff's office in Florida. And so I was even looking at things like the use of different software platforms in policing. I mean, stuff that's like way out in right field for me. But I was interested in it, so I kind of jumped in there. And so to put a number on it in terms of the actual number of projects, I mean, probably a lot. I don't know, 20, 25 or something.
I mean, that
So,
is a lot. It's interesting, I think, how our perspectives of numbers change depending on the situation that we're in. But when we're thinking about research and active research projects, 25 is quite a lot to ballpark right now and have on your CV. So what are the general expectations of active research in your current position, or say in your career field? I'm not sure if our students have asked this question of their faculty mentors yet, but I'd be curious to know what those expectations are for somebody in your field.
yeah, so I think, these vary by university. So some universities require that you have a higher research productivity than others. And in the field, I think it's probably expected that you're just active, right? That you're working on something continuously. And so kind of somewhere in between there. Western as a university is really nice because it falls along the line that if you're research active, you're usually fulfilling those criteria. I myself am just like, I don't know, a little more interested in a lot of things, obviously, when we start tallying numbers. And so I'm probably more active than a lot of people. And that's just through personal sense of both pressure, but also just interest in learning a lot of different kinds of things.
Well, I think that kind of answers the second question I had was, how do you decide which projects to participate in? Does there have to be some personal relevance to the projects for you to engage with them? So essentially just trying to get to, what drives you? What drives your motivations to participate in these projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd like to see lots of different answers to that. For me, it's can the information be used to do to practice better in terms of criminal justice approaches, particularly to drug use, right? So that's what motivates me. And if I can make those connections in my head, where the effort can be used in order to guide policies and practices, then I'm usually willing to offer my or put my energy out there for that.
Yeah, and and I think that that's important for a lot of us when we're engaging in these projects, that we want to see some better outcomes. And I think what we want to convey to the students is that better outcomes sometimes is not necessarily a straight path forward or an easy path forward. In fact, and that's why I can't wait to really dive into this idea of the research enterprise with you, because that struggle I feel like from doing a project to seeing it in being utilized and changing things is sometimes very challenging and difficult to see so far off in the future. So before we get to that again, I think that it's important for us to kind of set the stage a little bit too with funding, right? So and help me out if I'm not making sense here, but right, it's nice to have some personal relevance with projects that you select. But it's another thing to get those projects funded. And so I'd love for the students to have some perspective when they leave SURP on what it means to work in that endeavor, to get a project funded, to get a research, to get research off the ground, if you will. So can you elaborate on what sort of research seems to be the best fit for funding? And do you have suggestions for students on how to take that next step?
Yeah, so in criminal justice, it's kind of unusual. I would say, I say that without knowing at all how other sciences are funded. So let me just say that in criminal justice, funding is it's based on trends and fads. And so like certain topics come into popular periods, and they ebb and flow for various reasons. And what our students should know is that criminal justice is inherently political. You cannot separate the two, and for very good reason. Just a real quick and dirty lesson is that our legislators, our elected officials, are the ones that make criminal justice policies. Our judges are elected, our sheriffs are elected. I mean, it by the very virtue of how the system is designed to operate, it is political. And so we can use the opioid epidemic, for example. That became a very relevant and popular issue because certain political leaders found out about this issue, and huge amounts of money were allocated through federal budgetary procedures. And so the CARA Act was passed. I think the original one was back in 2016. I don't know the exact dollar amounts, but massive amounts of money that was distributed not only for research, but to provide services to folks with substance use disorders in the criminal justice system. And so currently we're kind of experiencing that wave, and it will likely go away when the next set of issues appears, and the sort of bright, shiny object distracts politicians with budgetary needs. Even with the current pandemic, the COVID-related relief money has certain portions of it have actually been earmarked for substance use as well. And so you have agencies like the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, pushing out COVID-related money for folks in active recovery and seeking treatment and that kind of thing. So for the particular topics that I conduct research on, there are specific funding mechanisms available for it. And I don't think that all research areas are the same, right? So I don't know that you have, if you're interested in like a specific kind of business operation, or, you know, like researching the nature of, I was watching Nova the other night on lithium batteries and stuff. Like, you know, if you're into tech and engineering, I don't know exactly where those funding sources would be and whether they're as big and somewhat diverse as they are for studying drug use, drug control policy, and treatment type things that I study. So I guess I just present that by saying, like, A, there's large organizations that provide funding for this work, and B, I'm not sure if they're similar in other disciplines. And from a student's perspective, when I was going through the process and actually discovered that I liked research and wanted to do it, I found different places that had funding available. One of them, when I was in grad school, was actually from a private foundation. And so they gave me an award so that I didn't have to work and I could do my research and finish my degree. Wow. And so there are lots of different, I always tell students to, like, you know, as creative as you can be, brainstorming different places where you might search and find these opportunities. And then the other one too is that I always felt like I'd be counted out, or, you know, I was pretty self-deprecating, thinking I wouldn't have a chance in a competitive application process. But I had good mentors that said that, well, if you think of it that way, you're never going to get anything if you don't apply. And so you have to, you know, put the strongest application forward and just kind of hope for the best. But if you don't start the race, you're never going to have a chance to win one. So
I think that that's really sound advice. And so let me ask you this, from what you described, it seems a little bit like funding is a bit of a game, at least in your area, like whack-a-mole, right? Like funding for this pops up here, and then funding for this pops up here, and it goes away. How do you find that balance then, right? Like it seems that you're lucky because right now you're riding that wave of the opioid epidemic, and I'm not trying to make this sound positive, but do you see where I'm going? Like you are right in the heart of the current trend in that research enterprise. How do you think you find the balance, say, when that wave subsides, and do you have to shift your interests then, or do you think you keep on your same track?
Yeah, so I'd say a lot of people do. So a lot of people are in pursuit of grant funding, and they find themselves in positions where they have to be in a lot of ways. So their, you know, very survival depends on grant funding. We're lucky, not only here at Western, but just more generally, in that we don't have to necessarily do that. And so I would say that I fall in the latter category, where I just stick to the course, and then you know, continue to do the work. I always think of myself as the feather at the beginning and end of the movie Forrest Gump. I don't know if everybody's seen that, but
love it.
Just kind of floating around, and it's worked out well to this point. And by floating around, I mean, you know, I'm doing what I do, and the phone rings and emails come, and I'm surprised a lot of times at the opportunities that just seem to come out of the blue. So having the stability of a university position that values everything, teaching and service just as much as research, allows me to do that. If I were purely grant funded, I would give a completely different answer to that question.
Yeah. Well, and I love your analogy of the feather, you know, floating around. And one of the themes that we've been talking about this summer are those opportunities and being able to be open and in a position to embrace them. So does that for you also mean cultivating your networks, your professional networks, on a regular basis?
Absolutely. And it means to taking a chance. So, you know, I've had opportunities to go and present at things that I didn't think would turn into anything really. Mm-hmm. But probably the biggest one, and an anecdote I can share, is that being invited to go to a conference in California. And I'll never forget this as long as I live, just striking up conversation in the breakfast line with a guy, asking him where he's from and what he does. And this turned into the development of a national organization focused on pre-arrest diversion among police officers for people involved in substance use disorders. So it's just absolutely amazing to me that, you know, talking about getting strawberries for breakfast turned into something that's generated, resulted in making presentations at the Office of National Drug Control Policy in Washington, D.C. So you really don't know what's going to happen, and you just have to embrace the experience when those opportunities do come their way.
Can you tell me how long from start to finish, right? So your time in the breakfast line, getting strawberries, to presenting your policy or your research to the policy center. How many years elapsed?
Oh, that was probably 6 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a long, and I wouldn't say arduous. I mean, as long as you enjoy what you're doing. A lot of times I don't
Right.
think of what I'm doing as work. So, it's fun. So
Yeah.
it doesn't,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I think that that's important, right? Right. We have to
Mhm.
have that balance, enjoy something, right, about your work. Absolutely. So let me ask you this before we really kind of get to the heart of the research enterprise and get to some student questions. Um, what do you have any suggestions in terms of how you approach, regardless of the area, the funding sources? Do you have ethical concerns, or do you bring ethical positions to your decision making when it comes to finding funding? Or is any funding good funding? Does that make
Mm.
sense? Do you understand where I'm kind of coming from on that?
Yeah, and I think criminal justice is special in that way because it's not necessarily always an objective science in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of ways that others are. And by that, I mean, you have um, political orientations that vary along the spectrum, and the research can be used along that spectrum, right? So, for example, the work that I do, I'm really thoughtful about how the results are, just A, what is the research examining? And B, how can the results be used actually to undercut or undermine the intended outcome? And by that, I mean, so if we're trying to identify things that help people and get onto a pathway to recovery in terms of a substance use disorder and avoid entrapment in the criminal justice system, right? How can that be flipped around to say that, the criminal justice practices are actually something that would be a more desired option rather than affording somebody a chance to enter recovery or have treatment available to them. And I don't think that that's always the case, right? So if we're doing studies in like something in physics, like, that there's very little interpretation involved there. It's like a mathematical computation, A plus B equals C, so to say, and that it is what it is. But when we think about that in terms of funding sources, you have certain organizations that have political orientations, and people know that. So if you have a hyper-conservative organization, for example, that's putting out money and looking for research in a specific area, they are probably going to have uh, um, some criteria in place for what you study and how you study that. And the same goes, I don't know if there are any like super or much more progressive. Yeah, I think, to be honest, and I'm not trying to be, politically biased here, but I think the organizations that do that would probably be right leaning, because there's more sort of gravity behind the ways in which the policies can be interpreted that way. I know I'm being kind of vague, but well, drugs are a prime example, right? Legalization. If you wanted to find results that support legalization, that could be seen as a very progressive, sort of anti-conservative um, approach. And so you're going to have, if I've got on my desk here a study of the impact of reclassifying drug possession laws in the state of Utah. And so that right there should blow your mind, right? Knowing how conservative the state of Utah is. And they actually have reclassified drug possession. And so what they wanted to do was find out the impact of not putting people in jail for simple possession of drugs. And they found out, yeah, that's what happened. They had fewer people go to jail, but at the same time, the police officers arrested more people. So they're like, oh, we'll take care of this ourselves, right? We'll just go and arrest more. Now we have more people with criminal records for simple possession, even though they're not going into the jail. And so it becomes a sort of cat and mouse kind of game based on the nature of how these policies unfold.
So, and I think we're getting closer now to this conversation of the research enterprise and what it is and how it should work. But how do you keep an even keel when you go into these funding opportunities that may have caveats to how you do your research, or to what level you can share your findings? I mean, how do you keep an objective scientific approach to your work when and if your funding organization may have some political or otherwise, how do I want to say it, goals of their own?
Right. Usually it's best done right up front, right before any agreement is made to provide funding. Those conversations usually happen before any contracts are signed or any decisions are made. And so that's something that I always do right away. I always say, right up front, the data is the data, and the results are the results. And so we have to agree that if we're going to do this, then they speak for themselves. We can discuss what the findings might mean, right? And some of the things that may have informed the results that we obtained. But at the end of the day, we can't necessarily call hearts spades, so to speak.
Do you get to retain your intellectual property in these situations? Or is that something that is controlled by the funder?
So yes, the data usually that are generated from a funded project are, you were able to keep those. At the same time too, depending on the source, you might have to share them publicly. And so it often depends what the agreement is. And those are things too that are set up ahead of time.
Gotcha. Well, that's good to know. In fact, I didn't myself really realize that you could have that negotiating power when you potentially enter into these grant-funded opportunities. And so, students, I think that that's something really important to note in this. To be your own best advocate and to stick to your guns on what you value and what you want to pursue. And if it doesn't feel right or fit right, walk away, find something else. Would you concur with that, Al?
Absolutely. Yeah, you don't want to get yourself into a situation where you've kind of sold your soul to the devil, so to speak, right? Because you can't erase those things once they're released to the public. And it's much more so the case now, right? Where stuff's published on the web, like once it's out there, it's out there. And so, yeah, we have to be more cautious now than ever before.
So recently you participated in the opioid town hall, and students, I don't know if you had a chance to really see this. This was something facilitated and coordinated through Western, I believe, and the center. I'm always getting this wrong. I'm always getting tongue-tied on it. Jill, help me out. The Center for the Study of Free Enterprise. Is that did I get it right? Okay, yay. Yeah. But this opioid town hall that was held last academic year, it seemed like this was an opportunity to engage the broader community in discussions that could bring about policy change, or also talk about policy changes that are already being implemented. And so you were a cornerstone of that conversation. And I just want to be able to leave our students with some better understanding of what the research enterprise is. How do you define that? And Do you think that the research enterprise is operating as it should be?
Okay, so the research enterprise, as I see it, is kind of getting information to do just that, inform our decisions. Yeah, and I think that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, but at the end of the day, it's generating new information. We might use the term data. So collecting what it is that we're specifically trying to understand, and then being very thoughtful in how we apply that information to a practical situation. And do I think that that's operating as it should? Some degree. I mean, my hesitation, I think, says everything, right? No, the answer is no. And again, it goes back to I don't want to call everything politics. Again, criminal justice is political. So the timing has to be right. So you need the right leader that has the information available to them, and the ability to implement the change. And so that's what it ultimately comes down to. And the more experience I gain, the more I'm learning that it's less about the information, the data, the research, than it is about having the right advocate in the right position at the right time. And I know that sounds discouraging, but at the same time, I find it still hopeful, because if we have the research available, we just have to keep it at the ready. It's got to be on the desk for that person when they are ready for it. And if we don't have it, then we will miss the opportunity.
Well, I'm glad that you have shared that opinion openly and honestly, because I think that it's a relevant question for our time right now. We have the confluence of major societal shifts taking place right now, and I think for a lot of us in society, as we are going through and we're reading headlines, it's very easy to get warped perspectives. It's very easy to kind of get sucked into making what my mother would call rash decisions. And it's harder for us, I think, when we're in the midst of these grand societal changes, to be able to step back and say, okay, we still need to take time to learn, to understand the problem, and then be able to make the best policy decisions. And so I think that is, ties back to what you said earlier, right, about your work from the breakfast line to talking about your research at the Policy Center. It took 6 years. And so I think that if we have a better perspective on the work that we do, taking the time to do it right, do it thoroughly, and then put it in the hands of those that need to be well informed, I think we will be better for it, and the research enterprise will be respected more. I find that that might be one of our problems with people being willing to accept science and accept, say, data, because I think everybody in a fast-paced world now thinks that we have to be fast-paced and we have to make immediate decisions, immediate changes. And yes, there is a time and a place to make very quick decisions, and you have to sometimes without all of the information. But when you have the opportunity to do it right, we should always err to do it right, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and in criminal justice, I always say that the stakes are really high, and we often don't stop and think about just how impactful this can be. But we're talking about people's lives, first of all. So when somebody says that it's not life or death, it is in criminal justice a lot of times. We're talking about people's freedom. And so we're talking about somebody getting arrested and put in a cage versus not. And I think that that's huge. And even if to take it one more step, somebody say, well, if it's just an arrest, that's no big deal. But we've got loads of research too that show that an arrest, a formal arrest record, when you have to declare this, and in our informational age that we live, I can do a quick Google search and disqualify you from getting a job in seconds, right? Again, these are huge consequences of decisions that are made seemingly without any consideration at all. And so while, again, it's a unique set of circumstances that we have to largely consider. And just one more example, again, if we want to talk about marijuana legislation, you've got millions of people that have been arrested for simple marijuana possession. And then if the legislation is changed and all of a sudden that becomes legal, right? All of those folks their criminal records cannot just be wiped clean all of a sudden. So it's a pretty, maybe I'm exaggerating the degree to which the importance lies on this, but that's just kind of the way I see it.
Yeah, I personally don't think that you're exaggerating it at all, and I think that is the law of unintended consequences, right? When we make poor decisions without having the complete knowledge or the foresight to understand how that knowledge can be used, we open up a can of worms that for decades were impacting, like you said, people's lives and their livelihood. And so we're at 10:42, so we have gone a bit past my 30 minutes, but that's classic me. I want to get to some of these student questions. We've had some really good ones come up. I'd like to prioritize some of these questions, though, as it relates to our topic for the day. But I want to put it out there for anybody that's joining us, if they want to ask their question from your posts, students on Teams. If you recall those, or if you want me to ask your question for you, just let me know. I don't know, Jill, if anything's come up in chat.
Yeah, Tommy has a great question in chat. Do you want to go ahead and ask it in person, Tommy?
Yes, sorry, I had to get the thing wouldn't pull up. My question was, are there any nonprofit oversight groups or committees in the criminal justice field or even the sociology field in general that can facilitate the promotion of non-biased research? If not, do you think there should or could be? And if so, do you think they function effectively?
That's a great question, Tommy. In short answer, yes, there are. But the longer answer is that you have to pay real close attention to their funding sources, because a lot of them are publicly funded, even though they're considered nonprofits. So they'll be funded by federal grants, for example, which are subject to the current political climate. So the way that they even determine what the funding priorities are going to be on that particular administration's interest in certain issues. And so it's not to say that they should all be disqualified outright, but it's just simply to say that you just have to pay really close attention. And just if you're interested in those, you might check out the Urban Institute. That's one. The Vera Institute is another one. And then, of course, there are a lot of nonprofits, again, air quotes, that are actually very much politically leaning, and they're private. They're funded by private foundations that do, in fact, have political agendas. And
so the Urban Institute and the Vera Institute are two that you think are pretty non-biased and are function fairly well? Right.
Yep. And they're more or less publicly funded.
Are those criminal justice specific in their scope, or are they more general?
They cover an array of issues, but they cover lots of criminal justice issues. Okay. Mm-hmm.
I can ask a question if that's okay. So I would say I'm somewhat struggling with this at the moment, but especially so in sensitive topics of research, especially things that can be found in the criminal justice system, how do you kind of walk the line of sharing issues without attacking the people or organizations that may be kind of associated with these issues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, Kat. And I guess it all comes in the delivery, I would say. And I usually, if I'm presenting information, well, let me back up. So currently I'm working on a couple of projects with local sheriff's offices, right? And these projects are explicitly designed to address the substance use and mental health needs of folks that are in the local jails. And it's really fun to work with the sheriffs because they understand that things happen because of the way that policies are, right? So local law enforcement agencies are kind of stuck in a vice. You have pretty much the state guidelines over here, and then you've got our communities over here, and they occupy that space in the middle where my head is to do what they're told to do over here and what they need to do over here. And it's a really difficult situation, and I empathize with that because they've got to do it. And I approach that and let them know where I stand on this. It's not that I'm trying to drag them through the mud and air their dirty laundry in public. And at the same time too, they want to have this information because they're very much interested in doing things better as well. And so we kind of have this mutual understanding of one another that we're on the same team. And that helps to diffuse any potential conflict that might appear. And so if they understand that you're not trying to, wage an offensive attack on them, they're not going to kind of entrench in this defensive position and prevent you from collecting information and doing what you're trying to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So don't attack them like it's a one team kind of thing. We're all in this together. Presentability, basically.
Yeah, and that's just kind of a lesson for life that I've learned is that, I was taught at a very young age, right, that you get a lot more with honey than you do with vinegar. And so that's how I approach everything, that we can be friends until you give me a reason that we can't be.
Very sound advice. I say the same thing, Al, and I also think too, Kat, not to pun on your name a bit, but it's like interacting with cats. Actually, cats can be very prickly, and you have to approach them kind of from the back to get what you want. You know what I'm saying? So, I think that's really really sound advice, Al. Other questions that we have? Well, if it's okay, I'm going to read some off from the team. Oh, sorry, go Matt. You have a question?
Yeah, for I guess. Can y'all hear me all right? I know my Wi-Fi tends to be pretty bad. So I would like to know more, and I don't know if this is really what you study or anything, but I would like to know more about how police immunity works.
What was the second part? How police and what?
Police immunity, like when they're immune, having to pay for certain damages that they've caused and things like that.
Yeah, so I'll openly say I don't know very much about that. And generally, it's, just a very kind of general response to that is agencies carry really big insurance policies.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's usually how that happens. And in terms of like criminal sanctions for certain kinds of behavior, that's usually carried out on a case-by-case basis. And so not to get too far off on a tangent, but if you look at things like the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, where the district attorney decided not to press charges against the officers, that was one way. We're here now with the George Floyd case that's currently unfolding in Minneapolis. The district attorney has pressed murder charges. And so, they're usually taken on a case by case. And if there's some sort of like shootout or chase or something, that usually falls to the civil liability portion and insurance coverage, as I understand it.
Okay. So that kind of insurance program can like offer certain payouts.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yep. Yeah, you have things like paid administrative leave and the covering of damage to physical property and all of those kinds of things. Yeah.
Including like medical expenses if they were to have caused medical expenses unwarrantably.
Yeah, Yeah, and so too, we should also be, again, not to go too far off on a tangent, but like as citizens, we should be really concerned about the ways in which those budgets are allocated, because ultimately they do fall back on taxpayers in terms of covering those insurance purposes or coverages. And this was really striking to me when I moved to North Carolina, and I saw that the state actually has a pretty significant portion of the budget set aside for litigation. And so state agencies actually have a big pot of money in order to pay for protection against being sued, and also to sue other entities. And so it's built into the nature of how the system operates, which as residents of the United States, we can be quite proud that we live in one of the most litigious societies in the world. I'm being sarcastic to some degree there, but
yeah, surprising, but then again, not. Thank you very much.
no problem. And just a quick contrast to countries like New Zealand. So New Zealand actually has a piece of national legislation that says you can't sue, especially like recreational activity providers, which is why you can go there and go on these crazy adventures like bungee jump from the world's tallest bridge, and river jet boating with all this crazy stuff. And so it's built into the national system that you can't sue.
Hey, Al. Al,
Yeah.
could you say something basically like, so a student like Matt has a question about that sort of broad general subject. And so then how would you turn that into a research question or a research agenda?
Yeah, that's a great idea. I would start there by looking at the way that different states handle it. We live in this fantastic time when we can just hit the internet and start searching for some of this. And if you're willing to let yourself get sucked down the rabbit hole, you can find quite a lot of information, and it will start to, the way I think of it is it starts to tell you a story, as long as you're willing to follow the breadcrumbs, or another metaphor is putting the puzzle together. And so you might find that one state, if you wanted to dig into Minnesota right now for what's going on with George Floyd, and compare that with North Carolina or Georgia, for example, they just had another recent shooting of an unarmed black man. So if you wanted to look at how those states or the counties, Fulton County is real big, so you could probably find a lot of that information publicly. I'm sad to say I don't know what county Minneapolis is located in, but you probably find it pretty quick. So yeah, the short answer is it would just take a little bit of thought in terms of how you want to contextualize the question that you have. Do places differ significantly in terms of the coverage of property damage caused by officers, for example? And then you kind of go on this quest to find the information. It may be that you get a little bit down the road, so to speak, and you have to revise your question a little bit, but just always kind of giving yourself some boundaries and working toward finding the ultimate answer.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
If I may, Barnes, I'm gonna read your question that you posted about receiving grant funding, or do you want to ask that? Which would you prefer? I think it's a great question.
You can go ahead. You can go ahead.
Yeah, because I'll read it. So I think Barnes, he said, how would you approach receiving grant funding if your research doesn't necessarily have a specific end goal? And given your work with data, do you ever find it necessary to pore over particular data sets without having a formal hypothesis in mind? So I think that this is a question too, very much related to what Jill just asked, is, how do we kind of get this research off the ground and funded, but do we have to have the whole picture?
The short answer is no. And I was just doing this the other day, so this is a really timely question. I wanted to know what information we had available to us about referral sources for people that enter substance use treatment facilities. And so we do have these national data sets. And that's the other thing too, knowing about data sources is invaluable. And so the University of Michigan has this gigantic archive of data. It's called it's the ICPSR is the acronym, Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research. Oh, that's it. And so if you just drop that in Google, it'll take you right there. But there must be 1 million data sets on there. And so you can cruise through, enter a topic or a search word, and it takes you and gives you that. And so that's where I went. I wanted to know what the proportions of people referred to substance use treatment facilities looked like. And I was just kind of poking around and coming up with, trying to generate some ideas for different research projects. And so I ultimately saw that about 1/3 of the people that are referred to our substance use treatment facilities actually come through the criminal justice system. And so again, it's like, following breadcrumbs. And that was the first one. I got distracted. I had to attend to some other stuff, so I wasn't able to continue down. But I want to revisit that because I want to start looking at what substances they were reported needing treatment for, and just sort of kind of get a lay of the land, so to speak. But once you know that this information is available, then you can start to comb the funding sources and see what they're interested in knowing. And if you can find some alignment, at least in the topic, well, then maybe you can craft a research question around the topic that they're interested in knowing something about. And that can kind of get you to the particular mutual goal that you have and the funding agency has.
I'd like to add to that, and I think it depends on the field as well. I know that in math research, that's actually the norm. You don't go into a research project with an end goal. You have a vague idea of something you want to look at and investigate, and you just see what you can find with that. Because with math, if you have an end goal of, I want to prove this, and then on day 2 of the project, you find a counterexample, and you're done. You can't do anything else. So at least with math research, you almost never have an end goal in sight. You just have an idea of something you want to investigate. So
yeah, that's a great point.
And Al, do you do your own statistics, or do you partner or collaborate with other data analysts?
No, I do all of my own. Yeah. I learned really early on that to make a bad joke, right? 90% of people don't like doing statistics. So I found a lot of value, joking aside, in learning that. And I actually had a job as a graduate student because nobody wanted to do it. I was like, oh, I guess I'll do it. And then I figured out, well, hey, if I learn these skills, I'll be in a small group of people that is willing. And then I came to like it and enjoy it. So yeah, I do all of my own.
That's exactly what Andy said too when he was telling me, I'm taking 2 more statistics courses before I graduate with my PhD. And I'm like, oh, you've been at this for how long? But it's paid, it dividends. So kids, students, it's a good point.
Yeah.
Fill those holes where nobody else wants to do the dirty work. So I have one more question that I saw from Justin. And Justin, I don't know if you want to ask this or if you would prefer me to read about it, but I think it's a great one to end on because it kind of talks a little bit about that that work balance when you have multiple projects going at once. Justin, would you like to ask the question, or do you want me to read it off?
I can ask. The general gist of the question was, going off of your CV, it seems like you have a lot of research projects. And on top of that, you have them usually like 3 or 4 a year or more. So I was just wondering if you ever had a research project overlap with another research project. And if so, how do you keep those, how do you give them equal attention? How do you keep them separated? Kind of the thought process if you've ever had to work on multiple projects at once.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And it's kind of funny that you bring that up because I'm not a multitasker at all. despite what it might look like from the outside. And so in my brain, I see them very much as connected and informing each other. And so I'll also admit that I was able to keep them separate and kind of keep making progress on them better. Historically, I'm finding myself much less able to do that now. I don't know for what reason. I don't know if I want to pull the age card on that, or if my interests are, maybe I'm just not as good at doing it anymore, if you will. But I'm also kind of finding that I want to spend more time with something and concentrate on it more heavily than I used to. And so that's probably the bigger part of it. But yeah, before I was willing to spread myself thinner and look at a lot of different types of things, where if you do look at some of those topics, I think there's been an inverted funnel where I was kind of broad earlier on, and now I've kind of narrowed that down, and I only work on very closely related things. So that's kind of how I keep them organized now.
And do you find that now that you focus on projects more, like you focus on one topic more, that the quality of your research has increased, or would you say that it's about the same either way?
Mm-hmm. I would say it's about the same. I would say that 10 years ago, I would spend a lot of nights and weekends working on that stuff, and then I just kind of scaled back a bit, having children and getting other interests have taken away time in a good way, I think, and I have more balance now, which is probably healthier. So
thank you.
Yeah, sure. No, it's a great question.
All right. Well, it's 11:03. Do we have any other questions? This is the awkward silence moment. Well, Al, we had a few questions that were posted, and I think that they might be a little bit off the topic trail that we've been going down today. So would you be amenable to taking any emails from students who wish to follow up with their questions with you?
Sure. Yeah, of course.
Great. Well, with that, I want to thank you again for joining us and being flexible with your time today, Al. It was great to see you and great to get your thoughts on these perspectives. I think they're important perspectives for our students.
No, I'm happy to do it. The SURP program is fantastic, and I wish we could have it bigger and have more students involved. So anything, my experience with it was absolutely wonderful. And so I hope too that you all take advantage of it and take it as far as you can, because yeah, it's a unique opportunity. Speaking before about big research / party schools, right? This kind of stuff doesn't really exist where you could talk directly with faculty. So it's really a pleasure and something that Western values, and I do too. So.
Well, I can really tell, and thank you again so very much, Al. I owe you a beer after this.
Oh, no problem. But that does sound good.
All right. Well, take care, Al. I appreciate it.
You too. Have a great weekend, everyone.